Yes, so welcome to the Sandy's Know Your Rights presentation. Um, Before we get started, just wanted to introduce ourselves. Professor Chin already introduced us, but just in case you didn't see, I'm Rebecca Kim.
I'm Paroma Malik.
Hi, I'm Sarah Rosenberg.
I'm Isabella Sabri.
Yeah, so we're just so honored and happy to be here. Thanks for making the time to come out and stay with us. So you might be wondering, well, why are we here today specifically? Well, we're here to talk about the new OPWDD guidance, what it says and what it means for you all. Yes, so before we jump in, I pulled this quote from the OPWDD guidance that we will be talking about today. Would anyone like to read this by any chance? If you would like to, could you raise your hand? No worries if not. No? Okay. That's totally great. I can read it for us. So this quote says, "All people have the right to have friends." Oh, I think Alan, did you want to read this quote for us?
Yeah, I'll read it. All people have the right to have friends, engage in maturely this what's that word? Mutual decisions, social relationships, to feel economically connected to others, and to love and be loved. Our rights
Great,
are
thanks so much. Yeah, sorry, continue.
We may have lost Al.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'm not sure if he's
It's
maybe
frozen.
frozen, but yes.
no,
But thank you so much, Alan. Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, did you want to read the words on the pictures too?
our rights, our power, know your rights.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much, Alan. This quote is really important, and so we hope that by the end of this presentation, you can feel confident that you have the tools that you need to protect this very right. Yeah, so we also wanted to show you a little roadmap of what we'll be talking about today. So first, I'll be giving you a small introduction to the OPWDD guidance. Then Isabella will be going through some important definitions. Sarah will be telling you about what your sexual rights are and how your capacity to consent is evaluated. Paroma will discuss when and how your sexual rights can be limited. And lastly, I will end the presentation by explaining what you can do if your rights are limited or denied. So let's get started with the introduction to the new OPWDD guidance. So OPWDD updated their guide, finally. Why did they do that? Well, similar to the quote that we just read, or Alan just read for us from the guidance, all people have the right to have friends, engage in mutually desired social relationships, to feel emotionally connected to others, and to love and be loved. And so OPWDD wants to affirm that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have sexual rights, and to make sure that these rights are not unnecessarily denied. So they came up with this guide that contains information to help agencies in protecting your rights around sexual activity and sexuality. We'll talk about these definitions later, so don't worry if you're not too sure what sexual activity and sexuality really mean. It also contains information to help agencies in preventing sexual harm through determining if and when assessments of a person's ability to provide consent for sexual activity is needed, establishing agency policy and training related to sexual activity and sexuality. We won't really touch on this too much because it's mostly addressed to agencies and making sure that they do their training, whereas we're mostly concerned about what you all can do to protect your rights. But it's also there in the guidance. And finally, it also lays out when OPWDD can limit your sexual rights and what you can do in the case that that happens. All right, so now I will hand it over to Isabella to talk about some important definitions.
Can I just
Thank you,
ask a
Rebecca, and thank you everyone for being here. Sorry. Sorry, Marilyn. Yes, what were you saying?
So question, Rebecca, Isabella, is this gonna be for those of us that work at OPWDD? Will we have access to this?
Yes, that's a really good question. And yes, this applies to everyone who has OPWDD services. Great. And also just wanted to let everyone know that you can put questions in the chat or wait until the end, either way. All right, so I'm just going to go over some basic definitions that we'll need for this presentation. These are definitions according to the OPWDD. We're going to talk about what it means to be an individual, sexual activity, sexuality, consent, lack of consent, and informed choice. All right, so raise your hand if you get OPWDD services. All right, great. So thank you. And if you receive the services through OPWDD, as Marilyn asked, this applies to you and your sexual activity rights. Okay, so what is sexual activity? Sexual activity includes things that give you sexual pleasure. So sexual activity can include things like masturbation. It can also include physical contact between people for sexual pleasure, like having sex, having oral sex, anal sex. It can mean sexting, which is sending sexual text messages or photographs to someone else. And finally, sexual activity includes touching of the sexual or other intimate parts of a person, whether directly or through clothing. You have a right to make your own choices about sexual activity. So again, what does that mean? Everything on this slide: masturbation, sex, oral and anal sex, touching, and sexting. All right. And Cassie, did you have a question?
No, I forgot your name. No, it was just the question you asked before. I apologize.
Okay.
Rebecca.
No, thanks. All right. So it's also important to talk about what OPWDD does not consider sexual activity. So things like holding hands, going on dates, kissing, or hugging are not considered sexual activity. This means that when we discuss sexual activity, we are not talking about these things: holding hands, kissing, going on dates, hugging. Why does this matter? Because the OPWDD guidance only applies to sexual activities, so the things that we talked about on the previous slide. Okay. The OPWDD guidance tells you that you have the right to express yourself and your sexuality. So what does that mean? You have the right to be your authentic self, whether this is gay, straight, queer, non-binary, transgender. There are a lot of different identities besides the ones that I just said. You have the right to be who you are. Sexual self-expression is your right, and under the OPWDD guidance, you have a right to be a sexual person and express your sexuality, gender identity, and expression. So remember, you have the right to engage in sexual activity. Just really want to drive that point home. And you must have consent and capacity to consent before you can engage in sexual activity. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a really important part of this presentation, and that is consent. Every single person on this Zoom call has the right to sexual activity, but there is one thing that each person on this call must have before exercising this right, and that is consent. So you have the right to have sexual activity, but you have to have consent. How do we define consent? Let's start by breaking down consensual. It's voluntary. This means that you did not force anyone, you didn't pressure anyone, no one forced you, no one pressured you. It's knowing, which we'll talk about in a bit, and it's saying yes. So let's talk more about what it means to say yes. When people want to do something sexual together, they can both say or express yes because they want to, and not because someone is forcing or tricking them. There are ways to express yes besides saying the word yes. So really quick in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, either way, what are some ways that you can think of saying yes besides saying the word yes? What are ways that we can show yes or say yes besides the word yes? Yeah, Cassie, thanks.
I think you can like nod your head or something. Like you can
Yes,
nod
that's
your
a
head
great
if you don't
one.
want to like verbally say it.
Yeah, that's a great one, Cassie. Thank you. Nodding your head. Great. Yes. Anyone else have examples? All right. So besides nodding your head, like Cassie said, some other things you could do, thumbs up. You can have a nonverbal cue that the other person knows means that you're consenting. And in general, you want to make sure that the other person is showing positive body language. So that means things like smiling, maintaining eye contact, nodding. Yes, Heather?
And if you use like a communication device, you could like type in yes if you want to have, if you agree to having sexual contact.
Yes, thank you, Heather. That's a really good
Welcome.
point as well. Alan got something in the chat. Oh, yes. Thank you, Alan. I just saw your comment as well. So shaking your head, yes, or in writing. Thank you for bringing up in writing as well. That's really important. And Matthew, I see you're raising your hand.
Yeah, the sign language for people who can't hear well.
Sorry?
The sign language for people who can't hear very well.
Yes, yes. Very good example as well. Sign language for people who can't hear. Right. Thank you so much for all of those examples. Those are all really good examples, and just goes to show that there are ways to say and express yes, to show that you are comfortable with having that sexual activity, and explicitly agreeing to have sexual activity. Okay. So we can use phrases to help us remember what consent means. Freely given means you are choosing to be sexual with someone and they're not forcing you or tricking you. Reversible just means that you can change your mind even if you say yes at first. Informed means that you know about everything behind making the choice, and we're going to talk more about that in a bit. Enthusiastic means that you're expressing yes in a way that's clear. And finally, specific means that even if you say yes to one type of sexual activity, that doesn't mean that you're saying yes to other types of sexual activity. So for example, if you say yes to oral sex, that doesn't mean that you're saying yes to other types of sex. Once again, you always want to ask yourself before being sexual with someone else, do I and the person I am with have fries? Do we feel free to do the sexual activity without being forced or tricked? Do we know that we can change our minds at any time, so it's reversible? Do we have enough information to make this sexual choice so that we feel informed? Are we both excited to make this choice? And are we both on the same page with the specific sexual act that we are going to have? Okay, so now let's talk about what consent is not. You did not force anyone. You did not pressure anyone. No one forced you. No one pressured you. And consent is not dishonest. So that means that your partner cannot lie to you about the type of sexual activity, and they did not hide anything about the sexual activity. And remember, you can always decide that you don't want any type of sexual activity at any time, even if you previously said yes. Okay, now what is lack of consent? Remember that consent is about both people. So each person has to give consent to the sexual activity. If one person says yes and the other person says no, is that consent? Just shake your head or yes or no. That's right. It's not. So there are ways to say no besides saying no. And it's important to listen to people, what they're saying and their body language. So I have a few examples of things you could say up here. I don't know, maybe, I don't like that, I'm not sure, not today. Those are all examples of ways that you could say no without saying no. I'm going to ask again, everyone had great examples for how to say yes. Can people give some examples of how we could say no or show no? Yes, Heather.
Shake your head. Like
Yes.
side to side.
Great example. Shaking your head. Thank you, Heather. Anyone else want to put anything in the chat? Yes, Sophia.
Sometimes people, I've noticed, they just don't say anything at all.
Yeah, that's a really important one, Sophia. Yeah, if you don't say anything at all, that is not consent. Great. Yes. Mark. I'm sorry, Mike.
Walk or roll away.
Yes, that's a really good one.
Anything.
Exactly. Any sort of backing away, walking away, rolling away, anything. That's a great example too. Thank you, Mike. All right, yeah, great. So those are all really good examples. And so those are all ways that we can show no without expressly saying it. The OPWDD guidance says that both people who want to be sexual have to have the right to consent. So what is the capacity to consent? It means that you understand the nature of sexual activity. So questions like, do you have a basic understanding of the nature of the sexual activity? Do you know the consequences of sexual acts such as pregnancy, STDs, social or legal consequences? We'll talk more about that later. Do you know the potential benefits and risks of sexual activity? Do you know methods of protection that can minimize potential risks of sexual activity like birth control? And informed choice, so a person makes a decision after thinking about all of the options, understanding the risks and benefits, and how it will impact them and others. The person can make this choice by themselves or with the help of family and friends. Having enough knowledge is an important part of making an informed choice. So an example of informed choice, this is just one of many examples, is if you know that you are not on birth control and you know that you don't want to get pregnant, you choose to explore birth control options, you choose not to have penetrative sex, but to engage in other types of sexual activity, or you can refrain from sexual activity altogether. So your partner must also feel comfortable engaging in sexual activity, even if you have made an informed choice. You both have to have made an informed choice by thinking about all of the benefits and risks of engaging in sexual activity. All right, so now I am going to pass it off to Sarah, and Sarah's going to tell you about knowing your sexual rights.
Thanks so much, Isabella. So the next section of the OPWDD guidance we're going to talk about is what it identifies as your sexual rights. So The OPWDD guidance says that all adults are assumed to have the capacity to make their own choices about sexuality and sexual activity. You have the rights to make all sorts of decisions around your sexuality and what sexual activity you do. So let's talk more about what your sexual rights are. So first, the guidance says that you have the right to enter into a sexual relationship. That means that every adult has the right to enter into an intimate relationship with a partner and engage in sexual activity. You have a right to start and end a relationship how you want. So another right you have is the right to receive visitors and talk with others. This can be in your home or in a shared facility. You also have the right to have privacy when someone visits you. So this includes the right to have private conversations with people who visit you, and also the right to have a safe private space to engage in sexual activity if that's what you want to do. Another right you have is the right to make your own decisions about pregnancy, contraception, and family planning. This can include deciding what type of contraception or birth control you would like to use. You also have the right to get access to education about sexuality and sexual health, as well as reproductive decisions and family planning services. So this can include learning about these topics for the first time, or if you want to learn more about a specific topic. You also have the right to be free from sexual coercion or harm. So you have a right to live in an environment that's safe for all types of sexual expression, which we talked about earlier, and sexual identities. You also have a right to be in an environment where everyone can say or express yes or no to sexual activity and have others respect their yes or no. So that's the consent idea we were talking about earlier. You have the right to be in an environment where everyone can consent to sexual activity. Finally, OPWDD must help create a safe environment by giving education about sexual abuse and what consent is to those who don't know anything about it. So education includes providing information on where and how to report anything that makes you feel unsafe. So we just talked about what specific rights the OPWDD guidance says you have around sexual rights, which includes the right to enter into a sexual relationship. The next section asks when and how your program planning team can evaluate your ability to give consent to sexual activity. So what does OPWDD mean by saying capacity, which is this next section? This does not mean that your program planning team can evaluate your physical ability to have sexual activity. What this means is when your program planning team evaluates your capacity, they're really thinking about is, can you give consent to sexual activity? So your program planning team would evaluate your capacity to consent through something called a sexual consent assessment. What is that? So that is a review of your capacity to consent to sexual activity. If you have the capacity to consent to sexual activity, then your type of consent or the ability to say yes or no to sexual activity is called informed consent. So when your program planning team is evaluating your capacity to consent, they do this through conducting a sexual consent assessment. And again, if they find that you can give consent through this assessment, then you have the right to give informed consent. So we'll discuss a little later on how the sexual consent assessment assesses your ability to give informed consent. So before we get into more details, let's start with what rights you have if your program planning team wants to conduct a sexual consent assessment. So these rights include all of the rights we talked about earlier, like the right to enter into a sexual relationship, have privacy, have conversations with others, and make your own decisions about contraception and pregnancy. Your rights in a sexual consent assessment also mean that if your program planning team wants to conduct a sexual consent assessment, they start by assuming you are able to give informed consent to sexual activity. Another right you have in a sexual consent assessment is that it's up to your program planning team to show a reason to limit your sexual rights. Your program planning team is the one who has to prove that you cannot give informed consent, and they have to show a specific reason why you cannot consent before your rights can be limited. You yourself do not have to prove anything in a sexual consent assessment. One more right you have in a sexual consent assessment is that you can say if your program planning team asks you to take a sexual consent assessment. And if you say no, this cannot be held against you, and it cannot be a reason why you cannot give informed consent. So Rebecca will talk more later on in the presentation about what happens if you say no. But for the purposes of this section, just know that you have a right to say no to a sexual consent assessment. Okay, so when can your program planning team ask you to take a sexual consent assessment? They can conduct a sexual consent assessment only when two things happen. Both of these things have to happen in order for your rights to be assessed. So first, you must clearly express you want to engage in sexual activity, or you already have. If you are not interested in sexual activity, your program planning team has no right to conduct a sexual consent assessment. So remember, what is sexual activity? Does anyone want to raise their hand or share in chat what sexual activity is from this slide? Yeah, Heather.
Yes, sexual intercourse is like, penis and vagina, especially when somebody just wants to do it for pleasure, they wear a condom, use birth control. And if they want to have a baby, they, I guess, do it without all that. And sometimes unplanned pregnancies happen. And then sexting is like texting naked pictures of yourself to someone else. Oral sex is sexual pleasure with your mouth on the genitals. And masturbation is feeling yourself down there.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. And Matthew messaged me. Thank you. Matthew messaged me as well, touching in intimate areas, which is absolutely correct. Heather, you also touched on something great, which is that there's all different reasons you could want to engage in sexual activity, to have a family, to be close with your partner, for pleasure. And these are all reasons why you might want to have sexual activity. So the sexual consent assessment that we're talking about only relates to these activities that we're talking about now. So if you want to do things that don't involve sexual activity, like dating or friendship or holding hands, then your program planning team cannot ask you to take a sexual consent assessment. So the second thing that has to happen for your program planning team to ask you to take a sexual consent assessment is if someone from your program planning team, like a doctor, a guardian, a caregiver, or a counselor, has a reason to think that you might not understand or agree to sexual activity. Basically, they're worried you might not be able to give consent. So both of these things have to happen for you to take a sexual consent assessment. You need to express interest in having sexual activity, and a member of your program planning team must have a concern about your ability to give consent for you to be required to take this sexual consent assessment. Great, so I just got an awesome question, which is, what about kissing? Is it considered sexual activity? I would say personally, I don't think kissing is considered sexual activity. And so if you're only interested in kissing your romantic partner or someone else, then you cannot be required to take a sexual consent assessment. So let's go back to this concept I mentioned earlier, which is informed consent. This is what the sexual consent assessment is evaluating, your ability to give informed consent. So what is this? Informed consent is a term used in the OPWDD guidance, and it's a way of evaluating your capacity to consent. Informed consent looks at specific ways you can communicate when you're giving consent or saying yes or no to sexual activity. So let's break down informed consent. As we discussed earlier, consent is saying or expressing yes to sexual activity because you want to engage in sexual activity. And we talked about all sorts of ways you can do that. Sign language, nodding your head, thumbs up, they're using assisted devices, all sorts of things. So what's the informed part of informed consent? The OPWDD guidance has created 3 factors to look at to decide if your consent is informed. Your consent has to be knowing, informed, and voluntary. So in the OPWDD guidance, they call knowing consent knowledge, informed consent rationality, and voluntary consent voluntariness. So these 3 factors, knowledge, rationality, and voluntariness, are the only factors your program planning team can use when deciding if you can give informed consent. Your program planning team cannot use your IQ score when deciding if you can give informed consent. Or sorry, they cannot only use your IQ score. That can't be the only thing they look at. So the first thing your program planning team will look at to decide if you can give informed consent is knowledge or knowing consent. Some things your program planning team will consider for this factor is, do you have a basic understanding of the nature of sexual activity? Do you know the consequences of sexual acts like pregnancy, the risk of STDs, or the social or legal consequences? Do you know the potential benefits and risks of sexual activity? Do you know methods of protection that can minimize some of the risks of sexual activity? For example, if I wanted to engage in sexual activity with my partner, but I didn't know how to prevent pregnancy, then I would not have the knowledge needed to give informed consent or knowing consent. So again, this is knowledge and understanding around sexual activity only. This doesn't include things like dating, kissing, or things that are not sexual activity. So the next factor your program planning team will look at to decide if you can give informed consent is rationality or informed consent. Rationality evaluates your ability to make a decision and explain why you want to engage in sexual activity based on all the facts and knowledge you have. So rationality includes questions like, can you make a decision about whether or not to engage in sexual activity based on the risks and benefits? Can you express why you're deciding to engage in sexual activity? So for example, if I said I wanted to engage in sexual activity because my friend recently did, I wouldn't have the rationality needed to give informed consent. However, if I said I wanted to engage in sexual activity because it feels good and I want to be closer to my partner, then that would be an example of rational consent. Finally, the last thing your program planning team will look at to decide if you can give informed consent is voluntariness or voluntary consent. This asks, are you aware that you have a choice to say yes or no to sexual activity at any time? And can you communicate that choice by speaking or by another method of communication? So for example, if I'm sexting my partner, which is sending them intimate pictures, and I decide I no longer want to continue, I have to tell my partner that I want to stop or that I don't want to keep going for my consent to be voluntary. If I don't know that I can say stop, or I don't feel comfortable telling them I don't want to continue, then my consent isn't voluntary. So this was a lot. So to quickly recap, the OPWDD guidance talks about when and how your sexual rights can be evaluated. And this is through something called a sexual consent assessment. Your sexual rights can only be assessed if you do both of these things. You have to express interest in engaging in sexual activity, and a member of your program planning team has to have a reason they want to evaluate your ability to give informed consent. And what is informed consent? So the OPWDD guidance talks about 3 ways to evaluate if someone can give informed consent. This is knowledge or knowing consent, rationality or informed consent, and voluntariness or voluntary consent. So the only ways your sexual rights can be limited is if you do not understand what sexual activity is, you cannot say or express your consent to sexual activity, or you cannot explain your decision to engage in sexual activity. So this wraps up our section on what your sexual rights are and what a consent evaluation is. Next up, Paroma is going to talk about how and why your program planning team can limit your rights.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So checking back in with our roadmap, we'll now be talking about limitations to your rights. So earlier we talked about your sexual rights. Does anybody remember what any of your sexual rights are? If so, you can either put them in the chat or feel free to raise your hand. All right, that's not a problem. It was a while ago, so this is why we want to go over it again. So your sexual rights include the right to enter into a sexual relationship, the right to receive visitors and talk with others, the right to have privacy when you're visited, and the right to make decisions about pregnancy and contraception, and the right to receive education about sexuality and sexual health. So these are rights that help us to express ourselves sexually. But there are some specific situations where your program planning team can decide to limit your rights if they decide that you do not have capacity to consent. Your right to start sexual activity can only be limited when all three of the following situations are true. First, the decision to limit your rights needs to be created through person-centered planning. You may already be familiar with person-centered planning. This means that during a meeting about your capacity to consent, you get to direct the process and speak about your goals as an individual. The aim of person-centered planning is for you and your team to figure out the supports you need to reach your goals. So it's important that your unique capabilities and preferences for your life need to be respected, and you should feel supported. Second, there need to be adequate clinical reasons for limiting the right to sexual activity. This means that the clinical reasons need to be current. That means that clinicians should base their reasons to limit your sexual activity on current medical knowledge. So if your program planning team cannot decide if you can give informed consent to sexual activity, they should ask a licensed professional for their clinical opinion. This could be a psychologist, a clinical social worker, a nurse, or a doctor who has experience working with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and somebody who's familiar with informed consent. Finally, your program planning team is who decides what limitations can be put on your sexual activity. If your program planning team has determined that you do not have capacity to consent, they may be allowed to put some limitations, but this does not mean that anyone else can put limitations on your sexual activity rights. If someone is not on your program planning team, they are not allowed to put limitations on your sexual rights. If these three situations are not true, your program planning team cannot limit your rights. So it's important for you to know that your sexual rights cannot be denied for no reason or arbitrarily. Your sexual rights cannot be denied because somebody wants to punish you. Your sexual rights cannot be denied just because your program planning team thinks it might make it easier or more convenient for staff. Your sexual rights cannot be denied just because a facility that you're staying at cannot find you a private place to engage in sexual activity. It's also really important to know that your sexual activity rights cannot be denied because somebody is discriminating against your sexuality. Discrimination means that somebody does not agree with your sexuality and is treating you differently because of it. As Isabella talked about before, sexuality includes both who you are attracted to and your gender identity. No one is allowed to limit your sexual activity rights just because they don't like the gender you are attracted to or your gender identity. And finally, as Sarah mentioned, your sexual rights cannot be denied based only on your IQ. And again, the only time when your sexual rights can be limited is when the decision was made through person-centered planning, when there are enough clinical reasons, and when the limitations are decided on by your program planning team. So if your rights have been limited, what happens next? First, it's important to know that if your program planning team limits your rights to sexual activity, this decision cannot be permanent and cannot last forever. Your ability to consent to sexual activity can change over time, and the limitations on your sexual rights should change with that. Your program planning team needs to make a plan to eventually remove the limitations, and this plan will likely involve sexual education and other services to help you learn about sexual activity and increase your capacity to consent. The decision to limit your right to sexual activity must be reviewed at least once a year. And so before a whole year has passed by, you should have another meeting to talk to your program planning team about your capacity to consent. The decision also needs to be reviewed again if there are changes in circumstances. For example, let's say that I had my sexual activity rights limited at a meeting 4 months ago. Since then, I've completed a sexual education or training program and have a lot more knowledge now about sexuality and sexual health. Even though a whole year hasn't passed yet, I can still ask my program planning team for another meeting so that I can tell them about everything that I've learned and explain why my capacity to consent has changed. And remember that OPWDD must review the decision at least one time a year, but you can always ask them to review the decision sooner and ask to meet with your planning team again to talk about your capacity to consent. If your program planning team limits your rights to sexual activity, the decision must be explained to you very clearly, and it must be in a way that you can understand. So that means that if you speak a different language, there should be a translator. It means that if you use ASL, the decision should be signed to you. If you use a communication device of a different sort, the decision should be reported that way. And it's not enough for your program planning team to just tell you the decision. They need to take the time to explain it, and you should be able to ask questions so that you fully understand it. The decision to limit your sexual activity rights should not be taken lightly, and any limitations on your sexual rights need to be written down in your life plan. The OPWDD guidance requires that any limitations to your sexual rights are documented so that you and your planning team know and understand exactly what decision was made. So if your program planning team has decided to limit your rights, they need to write down a description of the ways that your sexual activity rights are being limited. For example, if my program planning team could decide that I have the right to engage in masturbation and oral sex, but I'm not allowed to engage in penetrative sex or anal sex. This needs to be clearly written down in the life plan. And your program planning team also needs to write down the exact reasons for why your rights have been limited. This includes the reasons that came up during person-centered planning, issues surrounding capacity to consent, and the clinical reasons. If your rights are limited, you should be receiving person-centered interventions, supports, sexual education services, and other interventions that will help you to reach your goals of getting back all of your sexual rights. These supports and education services need to be written down so that there's a clear plan for how you will achieve your sexual goals. And again, as we learned earlier, your limitations on your sexual activity rights cannot be permanent. So there needs to be a schedule for reviewing and taking away any restrictions and limitations that your program planning team has put down. The schedule should be written down so that everyone on your team knows what timeline was agreed on. But again, this schedule is here to protect you. But you can always request a meeting with your program planning team sooner to go over your capacity to consent. And finally, you should just know that there are some rules about sexual activity that shared facilities are allowed to make in order to make sure that everybody is comfortable. For example, if you share a bedroom with another person but want to have sexual activity, you may need to schedule specific times for privacy, or find a different private place to have sexual activity. There also may be rules that limit having sexual activity in a shared space like a living room, but those rules still need to consider your wishes and preferences. Thank you so much for your attention, and now I'll hand the presentation back to Rebecca.
Thanks, Paroma. Yeah, so also I see that it's 2:02, so if anyone needs to jump out, feel free to do so. This meeting is recorded. So yeah. Yeah, I know you've had a lot of information just thrown at you right now, so I just wanted to see, how are we all doing? Can I get like a thumbs up, or are we doing okay? Can we continue?
Rebecca?
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much.
Rebecca, hello. Hi. So I just
Sandy,
real quick.
did you want to say something?
Yes. We typically move into another meeting at 2, and of course it's fine to be going over, but do you have a sense of how much more time is needed for this presentation?
For us? I think it's, is it okay? Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine.
Okay, that was my
I'm
fault.
just trying to get a sense of how much into the next one we might be going into.
Yes, so I think there's about 10 minutes left, or 5 to 10 minutes left.
So
Okay.
let's just ask, Shamika and then the rights role play team are next. Is it okay if this goes a little bit over, or are there people from the rights role play who
That's
need
fine. That's fine. That is fine.
Yeah, I mean, if people, I mean, because my meditation was supposed to be 10 minutes. So if they're going to take the next 10 minutes, that means that we probably need to skip the meditation. I know people really like
Well,
that, but
I just wanted to jump in here. If people are okay with staying till 3, we can stay till 3. Nothing stops us from doing that.
okay,
I
well,
can stay till 3.
That's fine as well. I mean, I'm available till 3 o'clock.
okay.
So
Yeah, so we'll just
if
keep
needed.
going.
yeah, let's keep going.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone. And sorry about that. That was my fault. My audio was not working. But anyway, so yeah, so just wanted to do a quick recap before we move on. So we went through a little bit of an introduction to the OPWDD guidance, and then Isabella went through some definitions, like what sexual activity is, if you remember this slide. Yes, Uli, did you want to speak on anything?
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem.
If I
No worries. Yeah, and Isabella also talked about what consent is. So if you remember fries, freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And then Sarah talked with us about knowing what our sexual rights are and how your capacity to consent is evaluated. And then Paroma just talked to us about possible limitations, and when your program planning team can decide to limit your rights. So finally, in this last section, and thank you so much for bearing with us, what if your rights are being limited or even denied? So that's what I'll be addressing in this last stretch of time. Okay, so what if my rights are limited or denied? You, your guardian, your advocate, or someone in your support circle can challenge a restriction of your rights. So first, you and your support circle can request a meeting with the program planning team that made the decision. The team must explain the reasons that they considered when limiting your rights, and you can raise any concerns that you have at this meeting. Second, the team must review the supports and services that are available to you so that you can be able to make informed choices about sexual activity or be supported to engage in sexual activity that you want. And if you remember, informed choice means having knowledge and understanding of all the choices available, the risks and the benefits, things like that. So what are the supports that you can get? OPWDD is supposed to ensure that you have support through sex education, counseling services, and healthcare services. So we'll talk briefly about each one. First, you have the right to receive sex education support. So this means that you should be able to get medication or contraception, such as birth control or condoms, to regulate if you want to start a family. You should also be able to learn about changing your body, how to have healthy sexual and intimate relationships, how to see and report abuse or harassment, and you should also be able to ask questions about sexuality and sexual activity and have them answered by someone in your team. You also have the right to receive counseling services support. So for example, if you have a history of sexual abuse, or if you've experienced things that affect your current decisions when it comes to sexual activity, you can receive therapy to address those specific issues. And then you also have the right to receive healthcare services and support. This means that you should feel comfortable talking about your sexual health and history with your healthcare provider. You can also talk about the use of contraception with them. You should also be able to get help if you want to learn about when and where to practice safe sexual activity, if you need assistance with learning proper hygiene and safe practices, or if you want to access needed items such as birth control and condoms. In addition to these, you should be able to get other guidance with your personal relationships, such as discussing these issues with a clinician, learning how to set boundaries, learning more about your body and what you're comfortable with, learning how to make sure you can have a healthy sexual relationship. Yeah, so the program planning team can do those things, and that might be it, or the planning team may request that you take a sexual consent assessment. But as Sarah said before, you do not have to agree to one. They can't use it against you if you do not, and they cannot say that you lack capacity to consent to sexual activity if you say no to a sexual consent assessment. So the program planning team would have to find a different way to determine your capacity to consent to sexual activity. But if you do agree to a sexual consent assessment, the consent assessment must be done by a licensed clinician. They will evaluate your capacity to consent to sexual activity. And if you remember, capacity to consent is having the knowledge and ability to agree to be sexual. Okay, so 2 things to know is that your life plan has to be reviewed yearly, like Paroma said. The program planning team cannot limit your sexual rights forever. And then any restriction or limitation of your sexual rights, including the assessment, must be in writing and in your file. Okay, so what if I still disagree with my planning team after having the meeting and after having them review my supports and services? So if you disagree with the results of the consent assessment or restrictions in your life plan, decline the assessment, the consent assessment, and the agency restricts your rights. Or if you don't get the sexual supports and services you need, then you can actually challenge the decision under New York law. So under New York law, you can request a meeting with the agency and your service coordinator. Remember, you do not have to do this alone. You can have the support of your family, friends, advocates, support circle, anyone in your life you want to be with you and to help you get what you need. So this meeting looks very similar to the meeting we talked about at the first step, where the planning team has to explain the reasons they considered when limiting your rights, and you can raise any concerns you have during the meeting. And just like before, the team has to review the supports and services available to you so that you can make informed choices. The agency has the same responsibility to you as before to give you support and services so that you can be your full sexual self. Okay, so what if you're still dissatisfied and if the agency still, after all of this, does not want to provide you with sexuality supports and services? Then you can write an objection to OPWDD and have a formal hearing according to the law. And during this time, you have the right to continue receiving services. Remember, you have the legal right to express your sexuality and to receive services of supports, and you're not alone in any step of this process. So hopefully all of these processes that I just mentioned can help you have a result that is satisfying and doesn't limit your rights. Because if you remember this quote that Alan read at the beginning for us, taken from the OPWDD guidance, all people have the right to have friends, engage in mutually desired social relationships, to feel emotionally connected to others, and to love and be loved. And the OPWDD guidance is saying this, so ultimately they want to make sure you do have these rights. So I hope that you feel more confident that you do have this right and that you have the tools to protect it. Yeah, the last thing that I wanted to share with you is this resource. It's a website called yoursexualhealthtoolkit.org, and Paroma can type this in the chat if you want to go take a look at it yourself. But it talks about a lot of the topics that we've discussed today, including sexual health, sexual activity, relationships, expressing yourself, The website is not completely finished yet. It's set to launch, I think, in winter of 2024 next year. But if you're just interested in learning more about it, you can click on this website. Yes, Kevin.
Just a second.
Sure, whenever you're ready.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and I thought we learned a lot today, and yeah, I think we learned a lot today. So I just wanna say that because I know we have to go on, so I don't wanna take up your time.
Oh, no, that's totally fine. Yeah, thank you so much, and feel free to ask any questions. Yes, Marilyn? You
Question I have is, for those of us that work at OPWDD, is there a way we can get a copy of this for our individuals that we help with? You know, because I work in the advocacy office. Is there a way we can get a copy of this that we can actually share with our individuals? Is there a hard copy somewhere going around that we can get?
Sure, you mean of this presentation?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we can definitely have this ready for you in a PDF file that you can share with whoever you need to.
Okay, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay. So yeah, just last thing wanted to say really quickly, we are here for you. Our professor's here for you. You saw her in the beginning, Professor Chin. We'll put this information in the chat as well, but you can feel free to reach out to her if you have any questions about this. And we can also, Marilyn, to follow up with that, we can, I think Professor Chin will have this PDF for you, and maybe she can distribute it to you all after.
All right, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, and so yeah, so this concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for being present with us, and thank you for being willing to stay a little bit extra. I know that you have other things planned, so yeah, if we have any questions, we can take them, but if not, we can be done and move on to the other activities that you have planned.
I think we're good. Uli, who was our facilitator for this first part, she had to leave. But unless there's any other questions, I think we're finished. Thank you. If anyone wants to chime in and say anything, this was an amazing, very informational, really good presentation. So thank you so much.
I just wanted to say, this is Heather Romanek, that I found this workshop to be very informative and helpful, and thank you for doing it.
I think Mike is facilitating the next part. Yeah, I think it was really great, and I'm glad we recorded, and as well, if we can share that recording with our groups like Marilyn was talking about.
Yeah, this was great.
Well, thank you, everybody. We'll sign off and let you do your next meeting. And it was wonderful. And I'll definitely circulate to Evan a copy of the PowerPoint presentation.